Welcome to the third lecture in my section on cultural tourism. This lecture looks at the relationship between our current context, globalization, and the new kinds of cultural tourism that we're seeing emerging. I'm going to move to the next slide. So, the context for all this is, of course, globalization. And as we spoke about in GES 111, what is globalization but flows of exchange of economic, social, and cultural information? Personal mobility, the internet, and the media publicize and speed up these interactions. So within this context, you have tourists traveling to consume cultural resources in every part of the globe. Sometimes these performances can travel too. So you would get traveling art exhibitions, music festivals, and so on that travel around the world. So who are the cultural tourists? And it's been argued that youth visitors and students are especially important for cultural tourism, and that most cultural tourists are highly educated people who are sophisticated and critical consumers of culture. If you want an example, think about the reading or the reflection that Enevoldsen wrote, about his interaction with the cultural villages that he confronted in South Africa. There's a book that I've been looking at for this section called Cultural Tourism, Global and Local Perspectives, edited by Greg Richards. So you should now be on the slide with the front cover of that book. And what's quite nice about that is that you can, in fact, go on the internet to Google Books, and most of the introduction is available there for you to read. But what's particularly interesting about cultural tourists, people that are specifically going to consume local culture, there are often tourists who are wanting a more authentic and a deeper experience than other types of tourists who might simply be going for recreation or to lie on a beach or something like that. So this idea of cultural tourists being a bit more sophisticated and wanting a bit more, I think is quite interesting. So how does the tourism industry work? And as scholars have written about it, it's worked by marking, this practice of marking. It's worked by marking certain places or sites, and sites in both senses, SIGHTS and SITES, as authentic. So we could say that the cultural tourism industry marks certain places and sites as authentic. And we've spoken about this a lot, of course, because the issue of authenticity is at the core of cultural tourism. It's kind of the holy grail of cultural tourism, because cultural tourists want to be certain in their own minds that they are encountering something authentic and that they are interacting with an authentic culture. And of course the word Holy Grail is useful because the Holy Grail is never found. It's a search for the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail in this case is authenticity. So the way it works is once a site of performance has been marked as authentic, and because it's authentic, it therefore is thought to be worthy of the tourist gaze, what should happen? Well, there should be a flow of tourists coming to gaze on these ritualistic performances. They often become ritualized. We saw that in the cultural villages. This is the problem. This means that cultural performances, that are created for cultural tourists are really contemporary cultural productions that are specifically sculpted for this market. So it becomes a spectacle on which the tourists gaze. Now, is there any way out of that conundrum or, dilemma? Okay, so there's been a reaction against the way that the tourism industry marks spaces. And this a new trend called reverse marking. So you should be on a slide with that heading now, new trend, reverse marking. So this is the emergence of the everyday, of the mundane, or the quotidian. Quotidian simply means mundane. Mundane meaning boring and everyday. So what if we make that a source of authentic experience in tourism? There's a quote in the reading which says, our everyday life is someone else's adventure. So if we can market our everyday life to somebody else as their adventure, then you've got a cultural tourism product. So now the aim becomes, instead of consuming some essentialized notion of culture, what you're now doing is aiming to experience other people's everyday life. So this is reverse marking. You actually, instead of marking certain sites as special and more authentic than other sites, you're saying that the everyday is in fact what's special. So there isn't a specific site which is regarded as more culturally important than others. And for tourists who go for this, they tend to pride themselves on going beneath the surface. Other tourists might still be consuming a more superficial cultural experience, like the cultural villages, but if you're trying to experience the everyday, suddenly you have a whole new perspective on cultural tourism, and you can pride yourself on getting a deeper insight. Slide. So here's a quote from this Richard's book. Reverse marking is an explicit strategy whereby one consciously ignores what is typically marked for attention and focuses on the mundane as though it were exotic and unusual. Rather than gravitating to what already stands out as exceptional, reverse marking tries to find the exceptional in what is ordinarily taken for granted, as unexceptional. I'll just read that second sentence again. Rather than gravitating to what already stands out as exceptional, reverse marking tries to find the exceptional in what is ordinarily taken for granted as unexceptional. Perhaps a slightly complex academic way of explaining it, but one is then seeing everyday practices and everyday life of people in certain spaces as what is interesting and what cultural tourists would like to consume. So this then frees us really from the cultural village idea, where a kind of essentialized version of culture has to be performed. And it widens the notion of what we're interested in cultural tourism. And this leads me to talk a bit about the township tourism experience in South Africa. So, in a way, this is an example of this move. Township tourism has been around for a while. It emerged in the 90s after the end of apartheid, and it offered an experience of local culture, the kind of experience that previously had been thought to be inaccessible and dangerous. It wasn't that easy for tourists to go to a township, say in the 1980s. And for many tourists, what people are trying to do is to get a glimpse of what everyday life is like for people who were previously marginalized by the apartheid system. I kind of worry about that because, in a sense, that's still constructing the place as exotic and dangerous and so on. it's exciting because it might be slightly dangerous. Nonetheless, it's clearly an advance on the cultural village concept. It's closer to people's real lives. But it brings up some other issues which are discussed by many writers who write about this question of poverty tourism. Because really, the idea here is to go and experience everyday life, and the everyday life really of poor people. So there's a photograph of a group of, I guess, European tourists, who are visiting a township. And they're standing by a sign called Buntu's Place. I imagine that they're drinking some beer, at the end of their tour. And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, coming to an everyday environment and that being the new form of cultural tourism. So if we're thinking about this poverty tourism thing, it is a worldwide phenomenon. It's often linked to development projects so that tourists can feel that they're contributing something whilst they're interacting with the locals in that space. In our case, it's township space. But in other parts of the world, Brazil, it would be the favelas and so on. It's about going to places where people are struggling to live, where the poor live. So in that sense, it is full of ethical dilemmas. And I found a really interesting reflection piece, which I'm uploading onto a Canva for you to look at. It discusses the ethical questions that every traveler should ask about poverty tourism. And it begins like this. Poverty tourism is in vogue. Well-heeled global travelers now regularly stray off the beaten path with the goal of understanding, quote, real life in the places they visit, dropping in on Brazil's favelas and New Orleans' hurricane-ravaged lower Ninth Ward. Reports are circulating that Norwegian teens are even participating in a camp that lets them role-play the experiences of real-life refugees, an experience promising to teach young people compassion via, quote, play, fun, and joint adventure. So that's kind of problematic. It's hardly surprising that these kinds of tourist practices have spurred a lot of condemnation. Critics argue that they are deeply exploitative, positioning the people outside the windows of tour buses as inhabitants of a human zoo. On the other hand, some travelers would argue that it's equally or perhaps even more unseemly to spend their vacations in the privileged shelter of resorts and designated tourist areas, because that would be ignoring the real problems of poverty. And is it better to go and sit in a fancy beachfront hotel for your whole holiday and not to engage at all with the poverty? Okay, so the writer of this article says, my own experiences traveling in Asia frequently forced me to confront these questions. I found no easy answers, but I do believe that when tourism is done right, it can change you for life, generating compassion, empathy, and understanding in a world that sorely needs it. So do read her full reflection piece. It's quite interesting, and I think it raises a lot of the dilemmas that we can think about in relation to this tourism of the everyday, and especially poverty tourism. Okay, but now back to South Africa. The next slide is a local example from Masiphumelele. And Masiphumelele is, of course, a township that's quite accessible locally. And I just found a website of a group of travel providers, tourism operators that are offering this experience. They call themselves AWOL bicycle tours. Now, AWOL stands for absent without leave. So it's quite a clever name because it kind of suggests that you're escaping from your everyday life. and you are going to be doing this bicycle tour. So the next slide, I just want to read some of their publicity material. Setting off through the township in the morning, our guide Zwei, a local in the Masiphumelele township, leads the way to a creche run by a selfless woman who cares for upwards of 20 children, despite not receiving any government assistance. This is where some of our tour money goes. Right, so they're positioning themselves immediately in terms of contributing, to local development. We listen to their singing and then tear ourselves away. We cycle down the sunny road, smiling at women washing clothes and old men perched on doorsteps. We wave at children congregated outside the community library, and once inside, marvel at the newly built computer lab. After visiting a sangoma, and then it goes on. I put that in italics because why do they have to visit a sangoma? It reminds me again of the cultural villages. There's something exotic about culture that now has to be shown off by the visit to the sangoma, which I think could have been unnecessary. Anyway, after visiting a sangoma, we tour the maze, which is spelled wrongly, it should be M-A-Z-E, the maze of the tin shacks in the informal section of Masiphumelele. So they've gone to the informal settlement now, where toilets are communal and electricity is for those close enough to the formal section of the township to share with a neighbor, or for the extremely ingenious, who can do illegal connections. Despite the lack of formal infrastructure, though, we are greeted with broad, white smiles and catch glimpses of neat, respected living spaces beyond the tin walls. So I've put that in bold because I think that that's part of this poverty tourism. The tourists are kind of reassured again by seeing that local people, although poor, are still happy, want to greet them, smiling at them, and so on. So in all the poverty, the fact that they're neat homesteads and smiling people, is reassuring for the tourists. Again, you can think your own thoughts about that, the way of presenting it. So the next slide then shows you. So here's one of the tourists, on her bicycle. It's a bicycle tour. And for a short way, she's carrying a local person by the informal settlement. A little boy is catching a ride on her bicycle. And as you can see, it's an everyday environment of an informal settlement with washing, drying on a fence, and people walking past. It's people's everyday lives. We end the tour at a local eatery where copious meat is bride before our eyes and later served up on clattering tin plates with pap and finely chopped salad slathered in mayonnaise. The ambience is loud and bustling and the smells are overwhelmingly good, a bit like the tour itself. Okay, and then the photograph of people drinking, I presume, homebrewed beer in a shack. So you're welcomed into people's homes, or you eat in a local eatery where everyday people eat. And so the idea is that you're getting a much more authentic view of people's lives and culture than you would at one of those staged cultural villages. Now, to the next slide, part of this is everybody looks forward at the end of the tour. I'm not saying the bicycle one, which sounded like a reasonably good one, but there are also shebeen tours, around townships. So there I think that the boundary becomes a bit more blurred, because are we saying that the township shebeen, visiting the township shebeen, now that's a cultural experience. Is it really a cultural experience, or is it in some cases an excuse for behaving badly? So in Durban, Street Scene Tours, another tour company, our shebeen scene tour is a pub crawl, African style, through some of Durban's most happening shebeens. And there would be a picture. So basically it's a drinking tour through the township. I'm not sure what you think about that. Obviously, some people who disagree, with alcohol consumption would find it reprehensible. And to me, it's also possibly a little bit problematic, because we know that shebeens sometimes are part, of the poverty, and people drink away their despair in these shebeens. So bringing tourists into that environment, is that a good idea? Anyway, as you can see, it's marketed as a happening scene. So if we were having this lecture in class, which I much prefer, because then I could interact with you, I would be ending it with a direct comparison between this kind of concept, where the everyday or the mundane becomes the site of the tourist experience, with the cultural village concept. And these are the kinds of questions we would have been debating, which I'd like you to think about. So in the township tour, is the portrayal more honest? I think unquestionably we would say that it's got to be a bit more honest, although there was probably certain parts that are staged. And what do you think about this focus on the mundane or the everyday? Is it really culture? Is it what you would like to see as culture? In this kind of thing, there's no dancing maidens, there's no tribal villages, and so on and so on. It's more about contemporary everyday life. So is it a more satisfying form of cultural tourism? Personally, I would think yes. And then another debate we could have is perhaps there's more potential for sharing the benefits. We saw that those cultural villages were often owned by white businessmen or entrepreneurs, who would then earn the money and just pay the performers a low salary, whereas perhaps in this form it's going more directly into communities. But then we could have the counter-argument that actually, isn't this even more intrusive? Are we not, in this type of tourism, invading people's everyday spaces and making them into a spectacle? I mean, how would you feel about tourists coming into your yard and looking around and perhaps taking photos of the washing on your line? How would you feel about being made a spectacle simply because you're poor? Is this not more intrusive? Whereas a cultural village, everybody knows the rules. It's a constructed environment and you go there for a specific performance, like a play. This kind of tourism is much more where the tourists come into people's lives and observe them. Are we not making then poor people into a spectacle? Because remember, the tourists, while they're engaging in the township, they're still gazing on the township. They're still in that way positioned as spectators. So I think that last question is where we can really, really get into some very interesting debate. I've seen a video where somebody from a township has taken a video camera and gone to an upmarket suburb in Cape Town, like Camps Bay or somewhere like that, where they've pointed a camera in people's faces and videoed them. And when people say, "What are you doing?" they say, "Well, just like they have township tours, we've come now to come and do a tour, of rich people." And I'll try and find that clip, because it's very interesting the way it turns things around. And it really makes us question whether this everyday form of tourism, the tourism of the everyday, is a huge improvement on the more conventional or stereotyped forms of cultural tourism. And I'm also very much hoping that we can go on our township tour and be ourselves township tourists on Friday. We'll keep you informed about that situation, of course, depending on what happens on campus. And there's my final slide. It's European tourists. They're looking a bit uncomfortable, some of them. They're taking a photo of whoever's holding the camera. But they're being looked at a bit quizzically, I think, by local people who might be wondering kind of what they're doing in their space. I think that's an interesting image to leave you with the dilemma, to have a look at that. And that's the end of the lecture.